Great. Hello and welcome to today's trainer education webinar, Excuses, How to Overcome the Employee Blame Game, hosted by HRDQ and presented by Ken Phillips. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour. Before we begin, note there is a question, or it may be labeled a chat box. It's located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can use this during the webinar to submit any questions you have, and then we'll either answer those questions as they come in during the Q&A session at the end with Ken, or email after the session. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I am in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Today's presenter is Ken Phillips, with more than 30 years of experience in the field of workplace learning and performance. Ken is an expert in the performance management, learning evaluation, and sales performance arenas. He is a frequent university presenter and speaker at ASCD and SHRM conferences. He has authored many learning instruments, including the best-selling Coaching Skills Inventory. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Ken.
Thank you, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending on where you're located in the world, and joining us on today's webinar. To get us started, what I'd like to do is just take a minute to run through the agenda so that you can see what we're going to cover during the hour that we're going to have together. And the first thing I want to do is just spend a few minutes. This is more context setting than anything else, but is talk a little bit about what performance coaching is and isn't. As probably all of you know, the term coaching has come to mean many different things to different people, and so we just want to be sure that when we talk about performance coaching, and as we go through the webinar today, that we all have the same context in mind in terms of what we mean by the term coaching. Then I'm going to share with you a 7-step coaching meeting model. So it's a model that I created of trying to take the coaching process and to break it down into a series of logical, interrelated, and repeatable steps. So we'll just spend a few seconds talking about the coaching meeting model, and you'll see where handling excuses fits in to that model. And then we'll get into the heart of the reason for our webinar today, and that's talking about the 3 most common ways managers handle excuses, and some of the ramifications of the 3 different ways that they deal with excuses. And then we're going to talk about 4 different types of excuses. So while there's literally hundreds and hundreds of different excuses that that employees can come up with regarding why things either didn't happen or why things did happen that shouldn't have happened, and I want to share with you some research and kind of science that I've done to take these literally hundreds and hundreds of different excuses, and to be able to consolidate them or categorize them into 4 different types. And the reason for that is because that leads us into our next point on the agenda, is once we have an understanding of the 4 different types of excuses, that leads us into 2 different techniques that we can use, or managers can use, for disarming excuses. And so that will be the last part of the webinar. And then, as Sarah mentioned, we'll open it up to Q&A at the end of our time together. So let's talk about performance coaching. And as I mentioned, the term coaching has come to mean a lot of different things to different people. Some people use the coaching to describe an occupation. Certainly there are people, and there may be some on our webinar today, people who market themselves as coaches, and they might be career coaches or executive coaches or life coaches. And certainly, that's one way the term has now it now gets used is as really as an occupation or a career. The other way the term coaching gets used and is often used is really as a style of management. And for those of you that are familiar with the Blanchard situational leadership model, you'll recognize that coaching is one of the 4 quadrants that make up the situational leadership model. So a lot of people use coaching when referring to a style of management. But the way we're going to use coaching today in this webinar is, as you can see here on the slide, that performance coaching is really an interpersonal process that goes on between a manager and an employee that focuses on improving on-the-job performance. And so the idea of improving on-the-job performance could be the manager holding a coaching discussion with an employee around an issue where there's a performance problem, where the employee is either doing something the employee shouldn't be doing, or isn't doing something the employee should be doing. But it also can be used in terms of improving on-the-job performance in situations where there might be, you might have an employee who's doing okay, and they're doing a competent job, but the manager feels like, they could do even better because they, and so they might use coaching as a method to help an employee to improve in an area where they're, where they're already doing okay, but could even do better. So that's how we're talking about coaching in this webinar today. Is really an interpersonal process. So it's not a style of management. It's also not a career. Not that those, and so we're using it. We're using it in a different context. The other way to look at coaching is it's part of the performance management process, and that's the way we're talking about it. Another way that we can describe the way we're talking about coaching today. So you can see this model of the performance management process, and it begins down in the middle, bottom middle of the slide where it says clarifying expectations and performance year begins. And that's really the start of the performance management process, where managers and employees are having discussions around clarifying expectations and getting some clarity around what's expected for the upcoming year. And then the year starts, and then during the course of the year, you see the 2 boxes off on the left of the chart or of the model that say feedback and coaching. And feedback is something that goes on throughout the performance year, where the manager would be providing feedback to to an employee during the year, either positive feedback to reinforce positive performance or good performance, or it could be constructive feedback to try to bring an employee back on track if they've strayed off track. And feedback tends to be event or situational driven. So, either something very good happens or something, something happens that, that the manager didn't want to have happen. And so they would use feedback as a way to, as I said, either reinforce the positive performance or bring the employee back on track if they've, if they've strayed off the path. Coaching also can occur throughout the performance year, but coaching is a little bit different from feedback. Coaching in the way we're talking about it, Ken. Coaching tends to be more focusing on patterns of behavior as opposed to individual events or situations. So coaching would typically come into play when a manager may have given feedback to an employee, once or twice or 3 times about, a particular situation or event, but nothing seems to change, and so the manager then decides to escalate the conversation and move it to a coaching discussion, which tends to be more of a formal meeting than feedback, and also is much more of a process, which we'll talk about here in a second. And so that's the kind of coaching that we're talking about today in our webinar. And then you'll see the last box in the performance management process is the end of the year appraisal discussion, and that's when the performance year concludes. And then you'll see the arrow dropping back down to the bottom middle of the slide, because then the cycle repeats itself with the next performance year. So let's talk a little bit about the coaching process. As I mentioned, that keeping in mind that box off to the left side, the third box up on the left side of the previous model, I've taken that coaching process and broken it down into these series of logical, interdependent, and repeatable steps. And when you look down the list, you'll see down at step number 6 is the step of handling excuses. And one of the things that we've done in previous webinars, this is actually my third webinar that I've done for HRDQ, is the first webinar I did, we focused in on the step of getting agreement, simply because it is the most critical step in the process. And that webinar is recorded, so that if you want to get more information about that step, you can contact Sarah, and her email address will be up here at the very end of the webinar, and you can contact her about getting access to that, to that webinar. And there was also an article that I had published in T+T magazine, which is ASTV's monthly magazine, and Sarah also has a copy of that article, which she'd be happy to send you. I did a second webinar around exploring alternatives and getting a commitment to act, and that webinar is also available, so that if you want more information about those steps, you can get access to that webinar as well from Sarah. So let's talk about handling excuses. So if we go and focus on what we're going to cover today is, although when you saw on that previous list, step number 6 was handling excuses, it probably would be a more accurate description if that step was really out to the side of the other 6 steps, because excuses can occur at any point in the coaching process, anywhere from opening the meeting to closing the meeting. But the most likely places where a manager will run into excuses typically would be in opening the meeting and getting agreement. It happens at opening the meeting, because oftentimes managers will say things at the beginning of a coaching discussion which cause the employee to become defensive, just by the very way the manager presents the reason for the meeting. And so that's one of the places that that managers will often run into excuses, and will have to deal with them, especially if they aren't careful in what they say at the very beginning of the meeting. So we're going to spend. I've got an example here that we'll take a look at for when a manager might say something at the beginning that might cause an employee to start, getting into excuses, and we'll look at that in a minute. But the second place that I want to talk about where managers are likely to run into excuses would be on the step of getting agreement. This is the most critical step in the coaching process, particularly when we're dealing with patterns of behavior. So it's something that's occurred, over and over again. And so unless the manager is able to get the employee to recognize and to agree that the employee's behavior is in need of improvement or development or change, the rest of the coaching process is not likely to be very successful, because without that agreement, there's little likelihood that in the long run, the employee is going to permanently change, his or her behavior. So those are the 2 places where a manager is most likely to encounter it. But as I mentioned earlier, it can come up at any point in the coaching process. So to launch us into a poll, and this first poll is around the opening of the meeting. So you can see the situation here at the top of the slide that's described here. So you've just begun a coaching meeting with one of your employees when she proceeds to start offering a series of excuses for her, performance problem. And so then underneath that, you will see the 4 response alternatives. And so what I'd like you to do is to take a minute to read through those 4 response alternatives and decide which one you think would be the most effective response to that situation that we just read there at the top of the slide. And after you've read through the 4, just jot down on a sheet of paper or remember mentally which one of the response alternatives that you thought was the best would be the best response. Because when we actually switch to the poll, due to the limitation of number of words we can have, you're not going to see the complete response alternatives. So you'll see the letters A, B, C, D, and then you'll just see a few words. So that's why you want to just take a minute to jot down before we switch to the poll what you think would be the most effective response. So just take a few seconds to read through there and come up with your answers, and then Sarah will launch the poll, and we'll see how you did.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll for everyone here. And you can go ahead and put in your answers there right on that poll. Oh, there is a clear winner so far here, Ken.
Okay.
We're going to give it a few more seconds here. The voting is still coming in. Okay. All right. It looks like we've captured all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll share the results here. And Ken, for your purposes, since I know you're having some computer difficulties, I'll give you the answers of what's come in. So A came in at 6%, B at 9%, C at 33%, and D at 52%.
52?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the correct answer is D, or the best answer is D. And I guess when we've done these other webinars, as Sarah knows, we put up items from the actual coaching skills inventory, and this is one of the items from the inventory. And given the audience that we typically attract to these webinars, they do much better, or you do much better than than the average manager or supervisor out there. So the step of handling excuses is the one that where the national norm that I've developed with other people who have completed the inventory and so on is the lowest score of all the steps. So people typically score lowest on the on handling excuses, but our group, 52% of you got the correct answer. So a little more than half of you got the correct answer. I'm not going to go in and talk about the reason why the others aren't good answers or are not as good as D. I think that'll become obvious as we start to work our way through here, because I'll begin to talk about the way managers typically handle the excuses and the types of excuses and so on. So I think as we get through the rest of the webinar, it'll become a little more clear why D was the best answer and why the others weren't as good. So Sarah, let's go to the next poll. So this one is, as you can see here at the top, while conducting a coaching meeting, your employee interrupts the discussion by stating a list of excuses for his performance problem. So this is an example of where excuses could come up at any point in that coaching meeting process. So this could be an example where it where it comes up with at the step of getting agreement. Could be exploring alternatives, could be getting a commitment to act. It could be any one of those steps. So same thing here, read through the response alternatives, jot down the one that you think, again, would be the best response to this particular situation, And then after a minute or two, or after 30 seconds or so, Sarah will launch the poll, and you can record your answer.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now. So capture which one you prefer, the A, B, C, or D. Oh, we've got some good participation here.
Okay.
The numbers are moving. Another few seconds, we'll have captured everybody. Okay. Looks like we've gotten all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share our results. So we have Ken here. A is 38%. B is 29%. C is 16%. And D is 17%.
Wow, that's interesting. So much more equal distribution on this one than the previous one. Well, the best answer, or the correct answer, the best answer is actually A. And again, we'll when we get through here, as we start working our way through here, I think that'll become evident about why that would be the best answer. Okay, let's talk a little bit next about how managers go wrong. As I mentioned earlier, despite the frequency of excuses, and managers are likely to encounter excuses probably almost on a daily basis, because they can come up in any kind of performance-related discussion. It doesn't have to be a coaching meeting. That's our focus here in the webinar. But certainly, just other kinds of one-on-one discussions, they can certainly come up in those as well. Can certainly come up in performance appraisal discussions. So they can come up in a variety of different places, and the three most common and ineffective ways, and this is based on my experience working with lots of different managers and supervisors and trying to teach them coaching skills. The three most common and ineffective ways that managers deal with excuses are that, number one, they will accept them outright. So they just accept the excuse without, engaging the employee in any kind of conversation about it. Or number two, they will discount the excuse by trying to minimize its importance, and we're going to go and talk about each one of these in more detail in a second. Or the third thing that they will do is engage the employee in an argument about the legitimacy of the excuse. So let's take a look at each one of those and talk about each one of them, so we can all have a better understanding of what a lot of managers end up doing when it comes to trying to handle excuses and which causes them not to be very effective. So the problem with accepting an excuse is that it sends a message to the employee that not accomplishing something as expected is acceptable. I mean, if the manager doesn't engage the employee in a conversation about the excuse and try to disarm the excuse or minimize the excuse, what will happen is that the employee gets the message that, okay, that I can get by with, not accomplishing things as expected. And accepting the excuse then also ends up reinforcing further uses of excuses. So if you have a manager who typically is running into lots of excuses from, his or her employees, one of the things that's worth looking at is, how they handle excuses, because if they end up accepting them, it tends to reinforce further use of the excuses. So going on to discounting, The second way that common way that managers ineffectively handle excuses is discounting is when a manager temporarily tries to remove an excuse from the discussion, but because it wasn't completely or adequately dealt with, it's likely to reappear. My analogy here is it's like, you know, you may be familiar with like the fairy tales about genies, and you know, genies typically live like in a bottle, and so you know, when they're not out doing their thing, they're, you know, kind of hanging out inside of a bottle somewhere. And this is what happens with discounting an excuse. So if a manager discounts the excuse, it's like taking the genie and pushing the genie back in the bottle and putting the, you know, the cap back on. But what will happen is, you know, sooner or later, because it hasn't been adequately dealt with, the genie pops up again. And so that excuse comes back into the conversation because it was just temporarily removed. It wasn't disarmed and gotten rid of. And so that's what happens with the discounting, and why discounting is not an effective way to deal with excuses. And the other outcome that can happen with discounting is it also can end up with the employee feeling like they've been personally discounted by the manager's response. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see an example here. So here was the employee's excuse, and this is an example of this, and then you'll see the manager's response here. But here's the employee's excuse. You know, I hear what you're saying, but I've always done it this other way. So that's what the employee is saying. You know, okay, I hear what you're telling me, but, you know, I've always done it this way. And so the manager said, well, you know, don't worry about that, don't worry about that. You know, don't worry about how you did it in the past. Just follow the new procedure that I described for you, and everything will be okay. And so that may temporarily, you know, get rid of the excuse because it's putting the genie back in the bottle. But because it wasn't disarmed and dealt with, what typically will happen is it's going to pop back up again later in the conversation, and so the manager's going to have to deal with it, you know, a second time and a third time and a fourth time if they don't actually disarm it and deal with it. So let's talk about arguing. Going to the next slide. Now, this is the third method that managers use to deal with employee excuses, and it's also, of the three, it's the most common method used by managers to handle excuses. And I think it tends to be the most common method simply because there's lots of managers out there who just can't, you know, tolerate excuses. I mean, managers and supervisors tend to be, you know, trained to be results-driven, and so it's all about, you know, getting the job done, getting results, achieving results. And so when the employees bring up excuses, and I've had actually managers and supervisors in training programs tell me that, you know, they just simply can't tolerate excuses, and when they come up, it's just like, you know, waving a red cape in front of a bull, and you know, it just sets them off. And so what happens is that if managers end up in arguments with employees about the excuse, it usually, or most often, or frequently, would result in a win-lose struggle between the manager and the employee, and you know who's going to win most of those arguments, and that's going to be the manager or the supervisor, because they, you know, they obviously have the greater power and carry the bigger stick, and so so they'll end up winning, but the winning usually comes at a price, and that price is the third point here on this slide. That by winning this argument about the validity of the excuse, is it causes resentment and results in, and this was a term that Stephen Covey used in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but I liked it, so I borrowed it from him. It results in employees who are known as outwardly submissive and inwardly rebellious. So they're employees who do exactly what it is you ask. They do no more, no less. They just do exactly what you ask. And so they're being outwardly submissive, but they're also being inwardly rebellious, because obviously there's a lot of other things that they could do, but they're not doing it because you haven't, made that clear or made it explicit, and so that's where they become inwardly rebellious. The other thing about arguing over the validity of excuses that leads to difficulties and problems in coaching discussions and any other kind of performance-related discussion as well is that it refocuses the topic of conversation away from the reason that you're having this meeting in the first place and focuses the discussion onto the excuse. So generally what will happen is, employees and managers are going to get involved in an argument around, is the excuse, legitimate or isn't it, or is it true or isn't it? And so the whole focus of the real reason we're having the meeting now is lost. And so now what will happen is, the manager's going to have to, get this meeting back on track, and that just makes it, a much more difficult process. So let's go on to the next slide. Oh, here's an example of the arguing about an excuse. So here's the employee comes up and says something like, other people don't meet all their deadlines. So the issue is around, the employee meeting deadline. So I don't know why you're picking on me. And then the manager's response, where they would get into, where they would escalate this into an argument, might be something like, we're not here to talk about other people. We're here to talk about you and why you can't seem to get all your assignments completed on time. Well, given that kind of a response, that's likely to escalate into an argument. And that's yet that's what a lot of managers will do or say when it comes to dealing with this kind of an excuse. So if those are the ways that managers commonly handle excuses and also ineffectively handle excuses, how should excuses be handled? And so just as a general comment, and we're going to go into more detail with this here in just a second, is that as a general guideline, what we want to do is we want to disarm the excuse by permanently removing them from the discussion, and we want to avoid either accepting them, discounting them, or minimizing them, or getting into an argument with the employee about them. So we want to get them off the, get them off the table, get them out of the discussion so that they don't come back up again, and so that they don't become an obstacle in the case of arguing to having an effective meeting. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of excuses. We need to have some understanding of the different types, because that leads us into the two specific skills that I mentioned in the agenda, or techniques that we can use to disarm excuses and permanently remove them from the conversation. Let me just share a little bit about how I came up with these 4 different categories or types of excuses. As I mentioned, I do a lot of coaching skills training, and one of the gateway activities that I have when I get to the topic of handling excuses is I do a brainstorm exercise with all the participants in the program around asking them to identify the kinds of excuses that they've heard from their employees, or maybe in some cases it might be excuses that they might have used with their boss. And so I just do a flip chart where I capture all the excuses and use that as a lead-in to going into the topic of handling excuses. And what I did is I started to save I started saving all these flip charts, and what happened is over time it occurred to me that regardless of the group I did, that there were some common themes that were kind of running through the excuses. And a couple of the things that I noticed was that, first of all, with every group that I did, none of the groups ever had any difficulty filling up, at least 1 page and sometimes 2 pages of flip chart paper with employee excuses, excuses that they've heard the employees use. So they certainly, come up very frequently in all kinds of performance-related discussions. The second thing that I noticed was that the lists were pretty extensive. So also, it wasn't just, a few things. It would be a whole page, or as I mentioned, in some cases, it might even be 2 pages of different excuses that, the participants in the program had heard employees use. And the third thing that I was noticing is that it seemed like that there that there were a lot of common excuses that came up in every group. There were always some kind of one-off things, where somebody might say, well, an excuse that an employee gave me was that, the dog ate my computer and the report was on the computer, and so that's why I didn't get it into you on time. So there's always, some of that kind of one-off stuff. But, the vast majority of the excuses, although the words might be a little bit different, they were basically saying the same thing. So what I did was, at some point, I took all these sheets of flip chart paper, posted them on the walls of my office, and started looking at them to see if there were, any themes or patterns that might emerge. And one of the first things that I did notice was that, yes, there were more similarity in the different groups in terms of the different kinds of excuses that they would come up with and identify. There were more similarities than there were differences. So there were more things on each one of the different lists that were the same rather than different. And the other thing that I started to think about then was, so there no longer were hundreds and hundreds of different excuses, which is what I first thought when I first started doing the training. And that was perplexing to me because I wasn't sure, exactly, well, how would you, help a manager or a supervisor be able to deal with hundreds of different excuses? So when I posted all the flip charts up around my office, and I was able to see that there were, on every one of the charts, there were lots of excuses that were roughly the same or similar on each one of the charts, I could narrow that, hundreds and hundreds of excuses down to, probably 25 or 30 that were pretty common, other than these, kind of one-off things where the dog ate my computer stuff. And so then what I started to do was said, well, okay, so we've narrowed that hundreds of excuses down to 25 or 30, but that's still, if you're trying to teach managers or supervisors how to deal with excuses, 25 or 30 is still, a fairly large number. And if you're trying to put a job aid together that says, well, okay, here's this excuse and here's how you would deal with it, or here's this excuse and how you might deal with it, that still was going to be, pretty overwhelming to people. So I spent some time looking for these common, themes or patterns, and what I was able to come up with in looking at all the different excuses that I collected is that it seemed like I could categorize them into these 4 different buckets or groups or categories, if you will. So I had excuses that fell into the category of diversions, excuses that fell into a category I called discounts, excuses that fell into a category that I called denials, and excuses that fell into the category that I called half-truths. And we're going to go through and talk about each one of these in a second. But the other value that I found in being able to take all these excuses and be able to categorize them into one of these buckets is that it gave a way then to take a look at these and create a first step in providing information for managers and supervisors on how to more effectively deal with excuses. So the first step in the process of helping managers or supervisors to more effectively deal with excuses is be able to help them understand, what category the excuse falls into. So let's talk about each one of these, and so you'll have a better idea about what each one of these what each one of these is all about, and also how they some examples that would fall into each one of these. So diversions are excuses that redirect blame for the performance problem back to the manager or back to the supervisor. And so if you look at the examples here, you'll see how how those excuses do that. So you're having a manager's having a conversation with an employee, and the excuse comes up, well, that's not my job. And so what in essence they're saying is, that the manager hasn't made it clear what was expected from me. Or the second one is even more obvious to that about, I didn't know that's what you wanted. So again, the employee saying, hey, you didn't make it clear to me this is what what I was supposed to do, or you never told me that, or I thought someone else was going to do it. So those are all examples of excuses that fall into this category of diversion, and they redirect blame for the performance problem back to the manager or the supervisor. So the second category are discounts. And as you can see here, discounts, what they do is they minimize the importance of a performance problem by either doing one of two things, referring to the past, and you'll see some examples here of that, or pointing out that others behave in the same way, and so I don't know why you're picking on me because my behavior or my performance isn't any different than anybody else. So you'll see some examples here. The first three are where the employee is referring to the past. You know, it's been done that way for years. You know, I don't know why we're changing or doing it differently. I've never done it that way before. You know, my previous boss never said anything to me about this before, so I don't know why, you know, you're making such a big deal out of it. Or the other one that falls into the discount category where the employee is discounting the importance of the performance problem is that they will use the excuse, you know, other people do the same thing. Other people don't, you know, or other people show up to work late. Other people don't, you know, turn all their reports in on time. So I don't know why you're picking on me. So that's an example of pointing out how others behave in the same way. So those are discounts. Denials, those are pretty straightforward. So it's really the employee outright, you know, just outright rejecting any responsibility for a performance problem. And you'll see some examples here where an employee might say, well, you know, that's not my fault. It's not my fault. You know, I hope you're not blaming me. It didn't happen on my shift. So those are all examples of, you know, denials where it's just simply outright, you know, rejection of the performance problem or performance issue. And then the fourth one, the category or type that I came up with are something that I've labeled half-truths. And these excuses point out a possible obstacle as a cause for a performance problem. I labeled them half-truths because there's always an element of truth in every one of these. So if an employee says, well, I didn't get it done because I got sick, or I didn't get it done because I just didn't get the paperwork on time, or I forgot, or, you know, I just didn't have enough time, or the equipment didn't work. So those are all examples of, you know, of obstacles, and, you know, they could, they may or may not be true, but and so that's why I've labeled them, you know, half-truths. So let's talk about, now that we understand what the four different categories are, as I said, that's step number one. You have to understand what category the excuse falls into, and what, you know, and whether it is a diversion, or a discount, or a denial, or a half-truth. And now we've got two techniques for disarming excuses, two techniques or skills that managers can learn how to use to disarm excuses and permanently remove them from the discussion. First one is called respond empathically. And using that technique, the manager would acknowledge the excuse by communicating an understanding of the employee's feelings and or point of view, and it's particularly useful with excuses that fall into the categories of diversions, discounts, and half-truths. Again, we're going to go into a little more detail on this one, on these in a second. And the second technique or skill that managers can learn to deal with excuses more effectively is called reframing or reframe. And it's turning the excuse into a problem-solving discussion that encourages the employee to examine his or her performance. And it's particularly useful when you have encountered an excuse that's just an out-and-out denial. You know, it wasn't my fault. So let's take a look at each one of these and talk about, you know, how we can employ either responding empathically or reframing to deal with the different types of excuses. So here on this slide, you will see I've broken it out into a table form. So you'll see the category are diversions. So the employee is redirecting blame for the performance problem back to the manager. And I've relisted here some of the different kinds of excuses that fall into that category of diversions. And here over on the in the far right column is the solution for how to deal with these excuses that fall into that category of diversion. So you want to start by accepting partial responsibility for not making expectations clear, not accepting total, but partial responsibility. And then once you've done that, then the second thing would be to clarify your expectations for the future. And the third part then is to make a note someplace of the date and time for of this conversation. So it would look something like this. In this next slide, you'll see the example. So here you'll see the diversion. You know, that's not my job. And here you'll see the manager using responding empathically to disarm that excuse and permanently remove it from the conversation. So here the manager is saying, okay, so if I didn't make it clear earlier that doing this task is also part of your job, then hey, I'll accept some responsibility for that. You know, that's my fault, and you know, and so in the future, however, I just want to make it clear, just so there isn't any confusion. Let me make it clear that, you know, completing this task is part of your job. And then probably would follow on, because you want to have some kind of discussion around it, so probably would follow on with some kind of a question. But this is a way, is a technique using that responding empathically to permanently remove that discussion from the conversation and get it off the table and turn the conversation back into a, you know, into a problem-solving discussion. And then, again, as I mentioned, the third point is after you've done this, then you want to make note of the time and the date and the time of the conversation. So if it does come up again, then you can refer back to that. We talked about this earlier on this date at this time, and here's what we had talked about, so that we've got that information that we can bring up again if we need to. So here's focusing on discounts. And you'll see here, again, we can use responding empathically. So discounts, again, our employee minimizes the importance of a performance problem by referring to either the past or referring to the fact that others do the same thing, and I've listed the excuses there. So the solution for this, using that skill of responding empathically, is to acknowledge that you see how you know, your expectations could be a surprise if there haven't been similar expectations in the past, or if the employee used the excuse about other people, you know, others do the same thing. Then what you would want to do is agree that others do the same thing. But the reason that we're talking about this is because it's happened more frequently in your case, and then cite the specifics of what that is. Then after you've done the part one here, then what you want to do is clarify your expectations. And then again, part three, note the date and time of the conversation. So the discount would look something like this. Here's the example. So the employee says, you know, it's been done that way for years, so they're referring to the past. And so the manager, responding empathically, would say, you know, you're right. And I can understand how the new procedure would require some adjustment on your part. However, in the future, I really want you to understand that I expect you to follow the new job procedure and not the old. And do you have any issues with that? Do you have any concerns with that? Do you have any questions with that? Some kind of question to, you know, carry the conversation on to make sure that the employee is, you know, has bought into it. And then again, record the date and time of the conversation. So again, this permanently removes that excuse from the conversation. Half-truths. The third type here, where we can use responding empathically as the technique or skill to disarm the excuse. So the half-truth, where employee points out possible obstacles. Again, middle column listed some excuses. So here the solution is acknowledge the excuse. The first time it comes up, what we want to do is acknowledge the excuse, clarify your expectations, note the date and time of the conversation. If it comes up again, then what we want to do is remind the employee of the previous conversation, restate your expectations, and then turn the conversation into a problem-solving discussion and note the date and time of the conversation. The example that I'm going to show you here is of for the first time. So the employee comes up with the excuse, well, I got sick. That's why I didn't get, you know, that's why I didn't get the thing done on time. And so the manager's response, using responding empathically, is like, well, yeah, okay, I know that can happen. Everybody gets sick once in a while. and it can certainly affect your work. In the future, when you have major deadlines to meet or job assignments to complete, let's agree to start meeting at least twice per week in order to update your progress. And so in this way, we won't get caught short again if you get sick right before the deadline, and then pose a question. How does this sound to you, or what do you think about this idea? And then note the date and time of the conversation. So if it does come up again, then you can do that the second time around description that I talked about earlier. So the last one are denials. So this is using that second skill or technique called reframing. So denials are when the employee rejects responsibility for the performance problem. And so I've listed the excuses here. And so the solution here is to let the employee know that you're not trying to cast blame, but you want to talk about the situation to find a solution to prevent the issue from reoccurring. And then again, note the date and time of the conversation. So let's look at the example, and so you can see how they've taken the excuse and reframed it into a problem-solving discussion. So the employee says, no, it's not my fault, don't blame me. And so again, the manager using the technique or skill of reframing would say something like, I'm not saying it was your fault, and I'm not trying to blame you. I just want to discuss the situation and see if we can find a way to prevent it from happening again. So, what do you think about that, or how do you think we might prevent it from happening again? So some kind of question to keep the conversation going, and then again, note the date and time of the conversation. So those are all the skills and techniques for handling excuses. This was again the 7-step coaching process, and as I mentioned earlier, handling excuses is one of those steps, although more appropriately probably belongs out here on the side, because excuses can come up at any point in the coaching process. And just to summarize what we talked about during our hour together is that there are 4 kinds of excuses. There are diversions, discounts, denials, and half-truths. And having an understanding and being able to categorize the type of excuse is the first step in being able to more effectively deal with them. And so that's certainly something that managers and supervisors need to understand and be taught. And then the next part of that is after you're able to categorize the excuse, then there are 2 techniques or skills for disarming the excuses and permanently removing them from the discussion. And those were the 2 that we just spent time talking about: responding empathically and reframing, and the different parts of those. So with that, let's go to some questions. I know we don't have a lot of time, Sarah, but we can maybe squeeze in a couple.
Absolutely, yes. Let's go ahead and squeeze in a few. We still have a lot of people on our line here today, and I do have questions that have come in. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll jump to those. The first question comes from Julie, and the question is, what's the difference between excuses and defensiveness?
Oh, that's a great question, Julie. It's a matter of degree and emotion is the way I look at it. And somebody can be fairly unemotional when they offer excuses. And when people get defensive, generally what happens is that the level of emotion has escalated, and so people are much more intensely involved, when it gets to defensiveness. And also what happens typically when people get defensive is they stop listening to one another. So if you've got a manager who's defensive and an employee who's defensive, what they end up doing is escalating the argument because neither one is listening to the other. And excuses, typically when they come out for the first time, is they don't contain that same level of emotion, so that if a manager is skilled at being able to handle the excuse when it comes up, they can prevent it from ever escalating into defensiveness.
Great, thank you. And we'll take one more here question, is from Bill, and his question is, why are some employees more inclined to use excuses than others?
Yeah, that's another great question, Phil. I guess my glib or humorous answer would be probably has something to do with toilet training. But on a more serious note, I think it probably has to do with how they've gotten away with it in the past. And if they've had previous managers or previous supervisors who haven't dealt with the excuses when they come up but accepted them, then that is going to reinforce use of the excuses, and so that makes them harder to deal with, and that's why some people use them more often, because they found that it works for them, that they're able to unbundle themselves from these performance discussions by just simply offering these excuses, and then they get accepted. So that makes it hard on a manager or a supervisor who has to come in and deal with that, assuming that they haven't been part of the problem where they've been accepting the excuses all along. But I think that's what you'd have to go back and look at is, what kind of previous manager or supervisor has that person had, or what kind of manager or supervisors do they have now, and to what extent have they been able to use excuses and just have them be accepted.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating today and for sending in your questions. We do have, if you want more information, you want to take a look at the Coaching Skills Inventory Facilitator Guide. You took 2 polling questions. They were directly taken from the assessment today. And so you can get a copy of the sample participant guide, the full workshop instructions, theoretical background. There is a PowerPoint presentation for an hour-and-a-half classroom session. And then we do have a 30-day return policy. So you can check it out completely risk-free. It is on sale for you. It's $25. Regularly $121. That offer is good through May 31st, and you do want to use that coupon code EXCUSESWEBINAR. So feel free, send us in any additional questions that we didn't get to answer. If you would like the additional webinars that Ken has done with us or the articles that he referenced, go ahead and just send me a little message. I have your email address, and I'll send those right out to you. Thanks so much, and we certainly appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.
Sarah, can I just also chime in that I will be sending you an article that I've also written on excuses that will have all this information contained in it that you will have available as well here shortly?
Perfect. Great. And we'll send that out to everyone on the line as well. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken.
You're welcome. Have a good day, everybody.